Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock today. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode. Now, here's Arturo Andrade to officially launch us into the fourth golden age of rock, starting in the magical year of 1991.
In the last episode, we covered the year span of 1987 to 1990, which served as a prelude/bridge period before the floodgates opened for the fourth golden age of rock. Well, those floodgates officially opened in 1991, year zero for the fourth golden age of rock, and the focus of this episode. The number of bands that release era-defining all-time classics is staggering. U2, REM, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Metallica. The number of bands that released singularly innovative and groundbreaking records that still resonate through the decades is also staggering. My Bloody Valentine, Teenage Fan Club, Slint, Primal Scream. One of the most eventful and important years in rock music history is discussed in full detail. Join us as the fourth golden age of rock kicks into full gear.
Well, now, Arturo, really excited to be back here, and we're on the verge of talking about 1991 in the fourth golden age of rock. Got to say, this may be the year that I have the most personal and emotional connection to. Any thoughts before, at this point in the episode?
Yes, 1991, like I think I've said before, is the year zero of the fourth golden age of rock. Like 1976 was for punk, like 1955 was for that early rock and roll. Like I guess 1964 was for the 60s stuff that followed. But before we get into this, I need to, in front of you, Chris, and all our curmudgeonly listeners, before we really get started, I would like to take some time to correct a major oversight that we committed in the last episode. Now, the last episode, the first installment in our 9-part series about the fourth golden age of rock, which all of you listening out there should have heard by now, covered the major bands, artists, and albums during the years 1987 to 90, which served as bridge/prelude years before the fourth golden age officially started in 1991, which is what this episode will cover. Somehow, among all the bands we discussed, we managed to neglect mentioning Fugazi, which is a terrible mistake. It really is. I mean, we talked about bands like Sonic Youth, the Pixies, and Jane's Addiction, all of whom invented new forms of rock music with little precedent. Fugazi belongs right there with those bands.
Yeah, how dare we ignore Ian MacKaye and the whole DC hardcore thing?
I know. I mean, and as far as their innovation is concerned, too, they emerged, like you said, from the Washington, D.C. straight-edge hardcore punk scene of the 1980s, with each of the four members coming from various bands. Guitarist, singer Guy Picciotto and drummer Brendan Canty were in the pioneering emo punk band Rites of Spring, whose sole album was covered in this podcast's Vault segment last year. Bassist Joe Lally came from the melodic post-hardcore band Dag Nasty, and of course, as you mentioned, singer-guitarist Ian MacKaye, the spiritual leader of the whole DC scene, was in the legendary hardcore punk band Minor Threat, and is the founder of the equally legendary indie label Discord Records. Now, Fugazi's music has been described as post-hardcore, but that doesn't really do justice to their sound. They've also been called straight-up punk rock, and that's kind of true, but only in the vaguest sense. They took the musical language of punk and deconstructed it, and then doused it with funk, dub reggae beats, heavy riffs not too far from Led Zeppelin and Queen, anthemic choruses, and shredding noise attacks inspired by Sonic Youth. Their coiled, gnarled, naughty yet intense sound was a huge influence on legions of bands from the mid 1990s onward. And the number of bands who have name checked them as an influence makes for a very long list. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Rage Against the Machine, Elliott Smith in his early punk band Heat Miser, late 1990s Blur, At the Drive-In, later breaking off into the Mars Volta, Archers of Loaf, Modest Mouse, Slater Kinney, Jimmy Eat World, Sunny Day Real Estate, Ted Leo and the Pharmacists, McCluskey, The Kills, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, and there are more. They were as well known for their business practices and socio-political beliefs as their music. It's safe to say that no American band in rock history, and I mean this, no joke, personified the revolutionary spirit and anti-consumerism, anti-commercialism stance of punk rock and lived it more than Fugazi. They were strict, straight-edge vegetarians who self-released their music on their own record label. They managed themselves. They booked their own tours in unconventional venues. They were their own PR agents, and their anti-consumerist beliefs were embodied by their strict refusal to produce and sell any kind of merchandise. Seriously, no merchandise. Most notably, they had a strict adherence to the policy of charging no more than $5 per ticket for all shows, no exceptions. As the British music journalist Everett True once observed about the band, Fugazi had, quote, Fugazi had a mindset that believed that any involvement with the system was corrupting and that you should create completely alternative structures outside of it. Their 1988 self-titled debut EP is arguably one of the 10 greatest rock EPs ever made, containing their most well-known song, Waiting Room. Their 1990 debut LP, Repeater, is an all-time classic that, among all their albums, is the purest distillation and exemplification of their unique sound and radical social beliefs and politics. They would spend the rest of the 1990s and early noughties releasing a string of consistently superb albums until their hiatus in 2003, which might as well have been a breakup because they haven't gotten back together since. So in case you're listening, Misters Mackay, Picciotto, Lally, and Canty, the Curmudgeon Rock Report dutifully apologizes for excluding your phenomenal band from our episode analyzing the years 1987 to 90 that led to the fourth golden age of rock. Fugazi, if you're listening, your recorded legacy is a huge part of the greatness of this golden age.
And that right there, folks, is our most legendary postscript to date. Arturo pretty much captured Fugazi. The only thing I'll add is that nobody did smart, angry with integrity better than Fugazi. I mean, that's kind of what you can call them, smart, angry.
Right.
We're going to cross over into the other side of the space-time continuum, as we usually do. But we're going to do it a little differently this time. Yes, we are embracing and exploring the parallel universe.
But with a twist.
Yes, with a twist. Over here, the superstars are the folks that we think they ought to be, filling up the stadiums. And not only that, but they're also the bands that should have a huge and monstrous legacy. And so we're now going to hone in on the parallel vault. Longtime listeners will recognize that we are now merging two concepts, and we are going into our what would you call it, anti-vault or sort of opposite vault?
Well, here's the thing. My parallel universe choice actually is a parallel universe choice because that album came out this year. But Chris, you are going to lead us into the parallel vault, which basically, for those of you who are in the know, it's albums that came out within the last 10 years, okay, that would have been huge in a parallel universe where rock music was still a pop cultural force.
Well, there you go. Okay, so that unties the knot, and since you are still grounded in the here and now, and I will be excavating much deeper. Get us started. Who are we talking about, or who are you talking about this week?
Yes, this is the heavy alternative rock band, the Mysterines. Not the Listerines, the Mysterines. They are a brand new band from that rock music hotbed of Liverpool, England, the same city that brought us terrific bands such as Echo and the Bunnymen, The Teardrop Explodes, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Dead or Alive, The Laws, The Coral, and some little quartet from the 1960s whose name I forget.
Yeah.
Reeling is the Mysterines' debut album, and it's fitting that we're reviewing their album in an episode of the Fourth Golden Age of Rock. Why? It's because their sound is deeply seeped in 1990s alternative rock goodness. They combine the bluesy grunge of early PJ Harvey, and yes, this is an obscure reference, with the sludgy, down-tuned rock of 90s Boston band Come, led by the incomparable singer-guitarist Talia Zedek. Like the latter band, the Mysterines are also led by a firebrand frontwoman named Leah Metcalf, who, while not quite on the level of a guitar player as Zedek, is a mesmerizing singer whose deep, sonorous voice dominates the album as its true lead instrument. Unlike their influences, they inject their music with radio-friendly, catchy riffs, which helps their case with whatever is left of modern rock radio at this point. Standout tracks: Life's a Bitch, parentheses, but I like it so much, which opens the album with a turbocharged thrust of authentic anger and attitude-ridden hard rock, the likes of which you rarely hear anymore, hence the grunge comparisons. Another track, Old Friends Die Hard, is a swampy, grungy blues rock shuffle that drips with sexuality and hedonistic thrill. Key lyric: Here comes Frankie, nice and sleazy. He's got something up his sleevey. You got Dangerous, which is such an early PJ Harvey knockoff that you would think they owe Polly Jean some royalty payments. But then you realize that the rock landscape could use some more people looking up to PJ Harvey for inspiration rather than the tired out old 1980s indie and synth pop tropes.
Very, very true. Very,
yeah.
very true. If this band is a gateway drug to PJ Harvey, we're better off for it.
Absolutely. The most surprising and oddly uplifting track on the album is All These Things, which is light shoegazer pop rock that soars with an arena-ready chorus. Leah Metcalf's lyrics are inconsistent in quality, memorable and striking with depth at times, and a bit sophomoric and full of juvenile self-absorption at others. But hey, it's their first album and they're young, so let's hope they grow into something great and not fall into the trap of being a one and done band like so many UK bands of the 21st century have been. Chris?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the PJ Harvey reference. I think that stood out to me almost immediately.
Yeah.
Because of the aesthetic and the fact that you've got a front woman unafraid to speak her mind. I'm going to run this one by you. I hear a lot of Black Rebel Motorcycle Club.
Oh,
In
nice.
the mix. I really that this sort of mid tempo, that's sort of that mid range between punk and metal.
Yeah,
that kind of sort of that big stomp, I guess you could say, in the middle. It's almost like a supple stomp.
Yeah,
I think they do have some of this. More trivially, I want to mention this before we move on. They are signed to Fiction Records, which is a subsidiary of Universal Music Group. Yes,
right.
these guys are a major label act. Fiction Records is most famous for being the Cure's label for 20-something years. And so they haven't been that relevant for a long time. And so it was interesting to see them come back up and also see the connection with Universal. So, hey, it's not just about nostalgia. There's actually still maybe possibly a path to get more than 6 listeners. or
Yeah.
they get sales of 50 albums. So
Right.
rock on, and hopefully the Mysterines, keep improving as they go along. Pretty good first effort.
Absolutely. All right, Chris. Now, our first parallel vault album ever. Give it to us.
Okay, and again, the concept here is that it, you have to scrounge around these days more than ever for the good albums, and it doesn't just apply to this week or last month. There's plenty of stuff within the last 10 years to go out there and find and catch up on and love. And so here we are, and I've done my digging in my parallel vault. Over there, by the way, I'm 6'8" instead of 5'4", and so things are kind of cool. And I have pulled out from 2014 the album Brill Bruisers by the New Pornographers. So let's get into this and talk a little bit about the New Pornographers in this album. Now, this band was conceived back in the late 1990s as an equivalent to a Western Canada rock and roll Super Friends.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely that.
Yes. This is when the wonderfully talented songwriters and performers A.C. Newman, Nico Case, and Dan Behar joined forces to create a very, very, very distinctive brand of power pop that diverged quite a bit from their respective solo work. Nico Case, both then and now, is renowned for her alt-country finesse. Her singing voice has been among the most alluring of the past 25 years or so. Dan Behar's band Destroyer is known for competent and loose songs tinged with folk and the gentler end of 70s classic rock. On his own, Behar is the epitome of an expressive yet traditional singer-songwriter. Check out 2000's Thief for Destroyer at their finest. And then there's Newman, who basically eats, sleeps, and shits melody.
Yeah.
Even his cutting room floor solo stuff is pretty and kind of inspiring. His early band is Zumpano and is worth investigation. Newman's most well-known songs as a lone performer are the swinging, catchy On the Table from 2004, and the more acoustic and more gentle and just as hooky Prophets from 2009. Now, when these artists get together, they wind up realizing a shared, wholly unique vision. This has been the case since their brilliant debut album, 2000's Mass Romantic. I know you're a huge fan of that album as well, Arturo.
I still think it's their best album.
Yeah, I think it's between that and their second record, the electric version. But anyway, so right out of the gate, they come out and they tend to start their albums with the title track. And in that case, man, it's like a rabbit punch between the eyes with this wonderful, merrily bopping, intense, taut power pop gem with a really cool vocal from Case, who co-wrote that song with Newman, Mass Romantic, that is. And then between that and other songs like Newman's The Slow Descent into Alcoholism and Case's Letter from an Occupant, are so joyful, so urgent, and so unusually inspiring, they can actually be described as special. The same held true for the follow-up to that record, 2003's the electric version, which I actually like better, just personal taste thing. If for nothing else, seek this album out for the Newman gem From Blown Speakers, which is basically one of my favorite songs by anyone ever. It's a classic tune worthy of a summer joyride in a convertible, and yet still manages to be poignant. The band's trajectory since then hasn't quite been as consistent or canonical, I would say. Notable drop-off for years following the electric version. However, there is one notable exception to this lukewarmness post-2003, and that is 2014's album, Brill Bruisers, which really surprised me and I love. Now, at that point in the band's history, Newman was essentially the dominant creative force driving the New Pornographers. It was essentially his band. Now, Behar contributed 3 songs. Case only contributes vocals, which still ain't a bad thing again. Regardless, A.C. Newman is the star here, and boy is he. Dude is on point on Brill Bruisers. The most stunning thing about the album is its beginning, which, like other albums by this band, starts with the title track. And to me, Brill Bruisers, the song, is kind of on a par and matches the wonder of Mass Romantic, the song. I would make that argument. Song features a pounding, echoing hook that is accompanied by sunny harmony vocals, low in the mix, that evoke Fleetwood Mac at their finest, and keyboard flashes slinking through the chorus. And then halfway through, we get this bridge where things get sharper, cleaner, leaner, and more gorgeous, with a dual vocal back and forth between Newman and Case. And then we ratchet it back up and end with the same echoey hook and those great little buried harmony vocals. One of the finest 3 minutes lightning bolts in a bottle of this parallel vault period, dating back within the past decade. And then from there, the album just keeps chugging along, hook after hook, memorable choruses in succession, and smart use of those keyboard flourishes. And even Behar, whose New Pornographer's output has never really moved me nearly as much as the other two folks, is on point here, sliding his songs along an electronic 80s spine and an unexpectedly orthodox big sing-along chorus. These songs, the best of these is called War on the East Coast. But then Newman punctuates that this show is really his in the lower third. I enjoy the song Dance Hall Domine, which is a hell of a rocker. I don't think would really be out of place on the electric version. It's got that kind of energy. So ultimately, this album plays like a creation that Newman was just itching to shape, mold, and enjoy while calling in his friends to have some fun. Final product is raucous, compelling, and yes, fun. Back in 2014, this album was a treat I definitely was not expecting. It's nice to still snack on it once in a while like I did this week. Arturo, any thoughts?
Yeah, this album, Bill Bruisers, is definitely their comeback record after a series of, in my opinion, really underwhelming albums after Electric Version. To me, I would describe the New Pornographers, for those out there who don't know them, I would just I would combine early Wilco plus Lindsey Buckingham era Fleetwood Mac plus a bit of the Cars plus REM at their catchiest.
That about captures it. And then like really fun late 70s bands like the Knack too. I mean, there's a little bit of that energy.
Mm-hmm. You know who also really loved this record? Our favorite critic, Robert Christgau.
No fooling. What did the dean have to say about Brill Bruisers?
The dean of music journal, or the dean of rock criticism is what he calls himself. Yeah. Quote, so arch and so in your face about it, they remain a case study in obscurity as banality with an attitude problem. Yet, the Brill building tease of the title parses. All 13 tracks, including the foreshortened Another Drug Deal of the Heart, are in-your-face lessons in pop song construction, fetching verse intensified by disarming bridge powered by dynamite chorus. If that's the pattern, they vary. Guitars are extraneous and electronics rule, old school synths rather than EDM rhythms, but electronics nevertheless. So let it roll over you and find somebody else to do your meaning for you, just like they're too arch to suggest in so many words. If it helps, I did find some inspirational verse that applies, kind of. Quote, they say we can't make this stuff up, but what else could we make? A-.
Yep. Yeah, there you go. Your resident curmudgeons recently switched our hosting platform to Podbean, and what a move it's proving to be. For the equivalent of $9 a month, we get quality, reliable hosting that allows us to distribute the Curmudgeon Rock Report wide and far to all the places where you find all of the other podcasts. We also get to customize a pretty good website. Visit us at curmudgeonrock.podbean.com. And we also receive some excellent statistics that tell us when and how you listen to this here creation. Most importantly, Podbean is its own community of podcasters and opens us and you to some pretty incredible music podcasts besides this incredible one. we urge you to especially check out History in 5 Songs with prolific writer Martin Popoff and Song Exploder, which expertly guides listeners through the making of a great pop song. Podbean, it ain't bad. So here we are in our time machine back to 1991, which for Arturo and I is a very personal exercise. Going into the year, we were both 15 years old, and this was really the year where our eyes opened to the possibilities of how rock and roll can be meaningful and shape our lives. Arturo has also called this year historically a demarcation point. I don't think that's arguable. And so let's get into the reasons why this is such an important pivot. Arturo, blast us off.
Well, what better year to start 1991 than the subgenre that defined it? Grunge.
There you go.
We call this section Territorial Pissings. And it's about the whole Seattle grunge and all the Seattle stuff that came out that year. And 2 bands and 2 albums in particular. You don't have to be a genius to figure out which 2 bands they are. If 1991 is year 0 for the 4th golden age of rock, then any discussion of the first year of the 4th golden age of rock has to start in Seattle, the birthplace of the subgenre that defined the decade of the 1990s. And if you're going to discuss Seattle rock in 1991, you have to start with Nirvana and Pearl Jam, the 2 main heads of the grunge hydra, whose albums from this year, Nevermind and 10 respectively, altered the face of rock music for the rest of the decade, defined an era and a generation, and established the 2 bands as the 2 most important American bands of the 1990s. Now, so much has been written, recorded, and filmed about these 2 bands, and it's really hard to come up with a fresh take on how monumental these 2 bands, and in particular these 2 albums, were, not just in how it changed the music industry, how they changed the music industry, but also in how much they affected the attitudes, minds, and souls of legions of rock music fans for, honestly, multiple generations. But hey, the Curmudgeon Rock Report will surely try.
Yes, we will, as always.
Yeah. So before Nirvana and Pearl Jam, you had people who were passionate fans of Guns N' Roses, Metallica, or even Motley Crue. But those bands, I will say, didn't mean as much to their hardcore fans as Nirvana and Pearl Jam meant to their fans. Their music hit much deeper, and the connection was a lot closer, almost all-encompassing. It was if through all the lead guitars, belting vocals, unbelievable melodies, and incredible songcraft, Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder were communicating directly to their listeners' hearts and heads and hearts, calling out to all the alienated and disaffected youth, providing language and imagery for all the feelings and thoughts that their young audience couldn't articulate. For those who cared about social justice and women's and gay rights, and were tired of the crass misogyny, homophobia, macho jock bombast, and overall conservatism that had crept into much of the rock landscape, here were 2 bands who let you know it was okay to be sensitive toward others and to listen to your left-leaning socio-political conscience. The only other American band that approached this territory, or the other 2 bands beforehand, were REM and Fugazi. But Nirvana and Pearl Jam had a much more populist appeal. Neither of these 2 bands went to art school, and their lyrics were never purposely difficult or even inscrutable. You can count this curmudgeon as one of those late period Generation X teenagers whose music-loving life was turned upside down when he heard and saw the Smells Like Teen Spirit video for the first time as a 16-year-old high school junior in his chemistry class. The video, of course, was shown via Miami Beach Senior High's local low-level UHF station that broadcast local school news reports and interspersed popular music videos of the day throughout.
Holy shit! I remember UHF. Whatever happened to UHF, man?
I know. For a lot of our younger listeners, Go on Wikipedia, look it up. I'm not going to explain it. Anyway,
Yeah, there you go.
at this time, my music listening habits consisted largely of 1960s and 70s classic rock, Beatles, Stones, Who, Hendrix, Zeppelin, early Rush, early Queen, early AC/DC, etc. And the little modern rock of the time that I was into was basically U2, REM, and the Black Crowes. The latter, while still being a great band, were nevertheless essentially a retro revival 1970s rock band. I became an obsessed Nirvana fan soon afterward, buying as much of their slim catalog as I could, their 2 studio albums at the time and all the singles so I could get the B-sides. Nirvana got me to listen to modern rock radio a little more, but more than that, they opened the door to me to the other Seattle grunge bands that were all popping up at the same time, Pearl Jam in particular. Modern rock radio most definitely caught this change in the rock music landscape most acutely. Nevermind was released in September 1991, and from then until Nirvana appeared on Saturday Night Live in January 92, with the exception of Guns N' Roses, you could hear a precipitous decline in how much LA-style glam metal was being played on the radio and MTV as well, until by the spring of that year, it was basically wiped out of radio sans GNR. It was such that after Nevermind replaced Michael Jackson's Dangerous as the #1 album in the country on the Billboard album chart in January 92, glam and hair metal were essentially killed off. And from there, after what Nirvana did for me, I went back to listen to all the cool indie and alternative bands that Cobain regularly name-checked in interviews. From there, I went even further back into my initial punk rock education, absorbing the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. Like with Bob Dylan and Neil Young, I wouldn't get into the Clash full bore until my college years. It's safe to say that Nirvana rearranged my musical DNA in ways that no other band or artist ever has before or since. And even more so than that, they helped initiate a change in the way I looked at the world and felt about things on a sociological and political level. And I know for a fact that I am far, far from the only person in my demographic whom Nirvana affected in that way. Chris, before I go into 2 important things about Pearl Jam, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, my experience was very similar to yours. I like to say that Nevermind and 10 are those albums that are kind of fall into the vein of where were you when you first heard this?
Yeah.
And it's not just for, gawky teens like us, awkward teens like us. It's for, anybody, really. I mean, there's just those albums that just resonate with you immediately. And just personally, I'm just looking back on it. One comment I'll make: I think that grunge became so exciting and so fresh that it entranced people to the point where any and all things associated with grunge became cool.
Yeah.
Even for people that had no clue about the bands, Seattle or DIY rock identity and culture, and even for those of us who did get it or thought we got it, maybe we got a little carried away too.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time obsessing and loving and having emotional reactions to the deep cuts on the Temple of the Dog record and the single soundtrack. Really didn't merit that celestially important status I gave them. So so that's just kind of a thing, which is to say that not everything was created equally during that period.
Right. So now let's go to Pearl Jam a bit and let's try and get a fresh take on 10. First point: while Nirvana's Nevermind had an immediate impact on both rock radio and MTV, Pearl Jam's debut 10, released in August 91, before Nevermind actually, was a slow burner. The singles Alive and Even Flow received consistent radio and MTV airplay, but Pearl Jam didn't become ubiquitous until the summer of 92 off of 4 developments: the enormous success of the soundtrack to the movie Singles, where Pearl Jam are prominently featured, their show stealing performances on the 1992 Lollapalooza tour, their scintillating performance on MTV Unplugged, and the huge rock radio success of their immortal power ballad, Black. By the time the single Jeremy and its narrative of a troubled teenage boy who kills himself in front of his classmates blew up on radio and MTV, 10 had already started to outsell Nevermind. The second thing to note is something that may be hard for younger generation rock music fans to understand. There was actually a time when Nirvana and Pearl Jam, two bands that history has forever joined at the hip as being the twin leaders of alternative rock revolution, actually divided their fan bases in regard to who was the more quote unquote authentic band.
Yeah, that's true.
Among certain sections of music critics and among hipster fans, Nirvana held the edge in authenticity because their sound was more rooted in punk and noisy indie rock. Even though Kurt Cobain was an unabashed Beatles maniac who also had little spoken of but plenty written about love for Neil Young, Led Zeppelin, and yes, Queen, he was quite open to the music media about the debt he owed to underground favorites such as Sonic Youth, the Pixies, the Meat Puppets, and the Vaselines. Much like how John Lennon would say to anyone who would listen about the Rolling Stones, Cobain dismissed Pearl Jam as grunge coattail riders who were commercial corporate radio rockers in disguise. Cobain clearly remembered Pearl Jam's past as the dreadful, slightly Seattleized glam metal rockers' mother love bone. But for their part, Pearl Jam never disavowed their debt to classic 1960s and 70s rock, which was quite evident in their music. Eddie Vedder adored The Who as much as Cobain adored the Beatles, and they both loved Uncle Neil. But a cursory listen to 10 reveals a band whose roots clearly lay in the guitar classicism of Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith, and whose rhythms were slyly indebted to the 1970s funk groove of Sly Stone and George Clinton. Seriously. Of course, all the music on 10 was already written before Vedder joined the band, and by the time of their third album, Vitalogy, Vedder had taken over the main songwriting in the band and brought a more hard-nosed punk and indie ethos. This would show itself even more in the band's refusal in later years to release music videos and to not play music venues associated with Ticketmaster, stances that were Fugazi-esque in their punk rock puritanism. But those are stories for future installments of this fourth Golden Age of Rock series.
Yep, indeed.
Just remember that Nirvana and Pearl Jam, the twin towers of grunge whose musical shadows still loom large 30 years after their breakthrough albums, were once seen as rivals. And to this effect, even though Cobain and Vedder eventually struck up a casual and respectful friendship, to his dying day, Cobain hated Pearl Jam's music.
Yeah, I mean, when we had Ronan Giavone, the author of a book on Pearl Jam called Not For You, Pearl Jam in the Present Tense on the podcast a few months back, we made this point that there's this notion that Nirvana was for the smart folks and Pearl Jam was for the dumb folks.
Right.
And that's kind of how it kind of materialized here, 30 years later. There's that thought that, Pearl Jam was the band of the people. But I kind of oscillated. I'll admit, I love Nevermind. I thought Nevermind was the most transformative record. I thought that was the better record. But the record that I was obsessed with for 2 years was 10. I mean, 10 is, when you're 17, 10 is like, the best record of all time because it speaks to like a 17-year-old. It's got that kind of, bombast and that kind of, let's face it, immaturity in some spots. I just remember that. And I think that, the other reason Pearl Jam is, again, the band of the people. And let's just put it simply, Nirvana lasted 3 years and faded with Cobain's suicide, and Pearl Jam eventually got happy and became, an arena touring staple. So there you go.
So we went from some underground, sludgy Seattle grunge to the 180-degree opposite, the biggest band in the world at the time.
There was no organic populist movement involved here. You too were absolutely made men. They were kind of the Billboard rock band of this time.
Yeah.
But they went through a metamorphosis here that resulted in something very special in 1991. Now, as we proceed here, I just want to make this point. You may be gleaning that a major theme of these brilliant building blocks of 91 we're discussing on this episode are unified by a palpable sense of time and place.
Right.
The fourth golden age of rock, after all, is by thesis supposed to have its Forrest Gump style moments of indelibility. Subjectively and objectively, I'd proffer that 1991 is the year for those of us who absorbed the fourth golden age of rock as it unfolded are transported back to in mind, soul, spirit, and emotion the most. So I just want to make that statement here. Now, take this, for instance, and now we'll start talking about U2. Now, when The Fly, U2's first single from the masterful, amazing, untouchable Achtung Baby, first hit rock radio, my first reaction was, what the hell is this? Is that U2, the authors of that perfect anthemic take on the American West called Where the Streets Have No Name?
Yeah.
Now, the second time I heard The Fly, my mouth started to drop a little from what I slowly was realizing was something of a revolutionary song. Next time I heard it, I was mesmerized. The drum machines beneath the edge's soaring, disembodied guitar wails, the distorted, cold vocals laid down by Bono, the lyric there about cannibals and thieves singing about their grief, and that aggressive, pulsing, instantly recognizable outro. And then came the video. Bono in those bug-eyed shades, the balding edge in a skull-gripping hat that he has not removed in the 30 years plus since, and the overall effect of darkness and shadows. Indeed, this was a much different U2, or at least a much different presentation. Don't judge the book by its cover, though. More than any album in my mid-teens, I would say that Achtung Baby changed the way I listen to music, probably even more than Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Now, they affected my fandom. They affected my enthusiasm. This album was just probably the kaleidoscope for me, the portal that really propelled it. And yeah, I mean, so I went back and I read David Fricke's 1992 profile of U2 and Rolling Stone. And I remember reading it back then too, and I learned that a confluence of personal and professional crises against a backdrop of a changing Europe. You got to remember that the Berlin Wall had just fallen, and we're at the pre-dawn of the European Union and Slavic ethnic cleansing. Now, that's a hell of a formula for reinvention. On the professional side, U2 had become so popular and so grandiose, they had become fodder for parody and ridicule and derision, and an exemplar for self-seriousness and toxic idolatry. Never mind, they'd released 2 classic albums in 5 years, namely War in 83 and The Joshua Tree in 87. And they had staged some undoubtedly legendary concerts. The inevitable backlash and the overheating of existing under a warm spotlight had strained band relations and plainly burned them out. Now, on then there's the personal side. Edge, Mr. Evans, was enduring a very ugly divorce and was grieving, something that touched Bono as a friend and an artist deeply. And so, at the turn of the 90s, the band finally said, fuck it. Essentially, they returned to Europe. They embraced the electronic and avant-garde elements bubbling up there in the continent, Europe. And they set up shop mostly in Berlin, but also for a time Sweden and naturally their native Dublin. They found the ironic humor of a world and a continent going mad and mixed it with the pathos of turning 30 and getting hit in the mush with real adult feelings. They worked again with producers Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, this time on their turf and in their more experimental aesthetic. Eno had heavily influenced and shaped, obviously, David Bowie's Berlin period records a generation earlier. And here, some of that magic mojo was transplanted, or, they traveled back into those days in those German studios. And I really got to say it here. I think that a lot of the hypnotic electro rock that was emanating from Manchester in England
Definitely.
had an effect. I mean, the Happy Mondays crawl in the cracks here and there at times on the record.
Yeah. They even stole a riff from the Happy Mondays.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Put all of this together, and we get Achtung Baby, the most extraordinary of movingly realized reinventions with the silliest of album names. Coincidentally, it's a reference to one of the more underappreciated jokes in the Mel Brooks film, The Producers. To me, there's never been another album like it, and there'll never be another album like it again. The themes are rich. The loss of intimacy born from the rise of technology, most exemplified in the astonishing Even Better Than the Real Thing. There's also the confusion and gut punch of lost love and friendship that gets lyricked all over the place. There's the desperation to hold on to what's precious, the undying longing for reconciliation and the way things were and should be, and the bitterness on the other side of it when that doesn't happen. See, until the end of the world. Now, sonically, the album can be categorized into two mythical buckets: discotheque with Neil Young on guitar, and a gentler and more exotically arranged balladry and public flaying in real slow to mid-tempo time. The unifying glue between these buckets is Bono's expressiveness that makes you hang on every word, even the dumb ones, as from Trying to Throw Your Arms Around the World and Zoo Station, which ultimately do not detract from the cry buttons embedded in one So Cruel and Ultraviolet Light My Way, the latter of which is really kind of become my favorite song over the years from this record. Ultimately, U2 with Achtung Baby embraced the true rock and roll thing of lamenting and celebrating life on the ground. Now, let's end this movement and discussion with an excerpt from that Frick Pen profile I mentioned earlier.
Nice.
And we're gonna quote from this. This is Bono riffing the way that Bono annoyingly does sometimes, but this is great. Quote: "Rock and roll is ridiculous," Bono states emphatically. "It's absurd. He is appropriately," this is Frick now, "he is appropriately still wearing his leather and shades." Back to Bono. "In the past, U2 was trying to duck that. Now we're wrapping our arms around it and giving it a great big kiss. It's like I say on stage, some of this bullshit is pretty cool. I think it's the missing scene from Spinal Tap. 4 guys in a police escort asking themselves, should we be enjoying this? The answer is fucking right. It's a trip. It's part of the current rock and roll that just drags you along, and you can feed off it. Mock the devil," Bono adds with a conspiratorial smile, "and he will flee from thee. In my soul, this album is still mine. Is it yours too, Arturo?"
Oh yeah, I mean, Joshua Tree is still my number one U2 album, but Achtung Baby is a very, very close second. There's very little I can add to what you gave, but this is what I am going to add. You mentioned the Manchester music from the late 80s. That was a huge influence on Achtung Baby, and The Edge has gone on record saying it. Another big influence on this record, and The Edge also admitted, was industrial music, particularly the stuff done by Skinny Puppy, Ministry, and yes, even 9 Inch Nails. Yes, The Edge was listening to Pretty Hate Machine in 1990. There you go. And so yeah, and he even admitted it. Like he's name checked them. So that also the industrial, it was a big part of that the kaleidoscopic weird sound that Achtung Baby had. It was an amalgam of glam rock, disco, funk, and psychedelia with dark ass weird guitars. And it's really hard for people, younger rock music fans nowadays, to really appreciate how jarring a departure this was for U2. Hearing this album, and the one immediately before it was Rattle and Hum, which is basically Joshua Tree Part 2.
Yes.
So it was really hard for people to imagine. It is hard for people to imagine how different this album was. And then the next year, which Chris, you will talk about in the next episode, the 1992 Zoo TV tour, how just jarringly different that presentation of U2 was from basically the Pilgrims on the cover of of the Joshua Tree. And also another thing, and I've mentioned this before. U2 is a band that people love to hate now and criticize. But what people need to understand, back in the 1980s and the 1990s, U2 were not only the most popular band in the world, they were the biggest band in the world for a reason. They were the closest thing you, Chris, our generation had to a Beatles.
Yes.
You know, that kind of band that were huge all over. They started somewhere and they progressed, and you have like the Beatles, you have eras of the Beatles. You have eras of U2. You have the early U2, which was, you know, them like basically the young post-punkers, you know, who were really eager. You had, you know, the militant political U2 of War and a little bit of the Unforgettable Fire, which was a transitional period to the Americana U2, the panoramic Americana U2 of the Joshua Tree and Rattle and Hum. And then you have this U2, you know, this mongrel, weird, like I said, amalgam of techno, glam rock, disco, funk, psychedelia, Manchester industrial, and all like tied together with the Edge's inventive guitar playing. And all of a sudden, Bono has an interest in romantic relationships. You know,
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So you have that Achtung Baby, which that era of U2, which I include their follow-up album Zeropa from '93 as part of, but we'll talk about that in a later episode.
Yeah.
So so you got to realize how jarring a departure this was for U2, and for music fans as well. And also, let's not forget, there was a time when U2 was actually cool. There was a time.
Absolutely.
There was a time. And they were hip and cool.
And this was it. This
Yeah,
was absolutely it. Yeah, and it was just like you said. I mean, pre-social media, pre-internet, pre-100-channel cable. I mean, to go from, like you said, the When Love Comes to Town in 1989 to The Fly in 91 is like, whoa, you know. So it definitely speaks to that era. You know, the world moves slower, but 91, I think, is really where things started to pick up, like you said, in terms of emotional connection, but also this meaning. You know, things were changing, and like you said, even the biggest band in the world was changing with it.
Now we go from a band who underwent a drastic musical makeover to a band whose makeover wasn't as drastic, but pretty substantial nonetheless. The Red Hot Chili Peppers went from pioneering funk rockers of the 1980s on the fringe or on the verge of mainstream rock acceptance to towering giants of 1990s alternative rock and a mainstay of modern rock radio for decades to come by this point, due to their 1991 breakthrough album, Blood Sugar Sex Magic, a true watershed moment for the band, for rock music in general, and one of the greatest records ever made. Now, while their tenure on EMI Records resulted in the innovative fusion of funk, rap, punk, and thrash metal, most notably on 1989's hard-charging and masterful Mother's Milk, Michael Beinhorn's production on some of those records was a bit muffled and sometimes obscured how powerful a live band they were. It wasn't until they crossed over to Warner Brothers and got together with producer Rick Rubin, known for the Beastie Boys and Run DMC and Slayer, that their sound... Did he produce Run DMC, Rick Rubin?
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yes, he did. Right.
Yeah, he was the Def Jam house producer. So yeah.
Got it. Okay. And it wasn't until they got with Rick Rubin that their sound was brought into crystal clarity while magically being made funkier than ever. Blood Sugar Sex Magic managed to have a refreshing live in the studio feeling to it, while at the same time having a sense of space that allowed the band to experiment with unusual arrangements and challenging guitar sounds, thanks to the brilliant work of guitarist John Frusciante. Didn't hurt that the band upped their game with the best, most mature and sophisticated songwriting of their careers up to that point. With Under the Bridge, singer Anthony Kiedis' searingly emotional account of his drug addiction, the Chili Peppers had their first genuine ballad and a massively huge crossover international pop hit that we all know now. Give It Away, with its sly appropriation of a Black Sabbath's riff from Sweet Leaf, is one of the band's all-time great funk jams, and to this day, one of their signature songs. For a band that had gotten some negative criticism for their dopey sex songs that bordered on misogyny, for example, Catholic Schoolgirls Rule, Party on Your Pussy, Stone Cold Bush, and Sexy Mexican Maid, it was refreshing to hear the band tackle romantic relationship songs that either sympathized with the woman's side of things, as on the polyrhythmic workout Breaking the Girl, one of my favorite songs, or delved into the nuances of love gone wrong, as in Anthony Kiedis' failed flirtation with Sinead O'Connor, described in I Could Have Lied. The album was a career maker for the Chili Peppers, and while many bands have had career-making albums only to see their popularity wane over time, the amazing thing to me about Blood Sugar Sex Magik is that the Peppers have never stopped being one of the biggest bands in the world after this album hit. So much has happened to them. Frusciante left the band due to not being able to handle how big the band had gotten. Dave Navarro replaced him for 1995's underrated and moderately successful One Hot Minute. Frusciante rejoined them for the blockbuster albums Californication and Stadium Arcadium in 99 and 2006, respectively. Frusciante left again and was replaced by this dude named Josh Klinghoffer for two truly shitty albums, 2011's I'm With You and 2016's The Getaway. Then Klinghoffer left and Frusciante came back 3 years ago. All the while, every single album they've released from Blood Sugar Sex Magik onward has produced number one songs on modern rock radio and Billboard's alternative songs chart. Every single album. We talked about Nirvana's and Pearl Jam's bond with their audience and how deep it went, especially with Pearl Jam and their Grateful Dead-esque following. But maybe we should reconsider how strong the Chili Peppers fan base is to sustain them as a top band 30 plus years after Blood Sugar Sex Magik. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's sustainability has really been kind of amazing, and it's hard to understand too, because yes, I mean, they're engaging and charismatic characters, but they haven't really been, at least Kiedis hasn't really been tuned in like he was for a long time.
Yeah.
Anyway, not really much to add to what you said. I do find it funny, in spite of their rising maturity vis-a-vis romance and women, that the first single was "Give It Away." Young lug chug a lug me, you know.
Yeah, and this album also has Sir Psycho Sexy.
Yeah, and so they hadn't quite grown up. I mean, look, the Peppers, to me, they're a wonderfully ridiculous band populated with remarkable musicians.
Yeah,
you know, really, I mean, the Anthony Kiedis of this era spit out a lot of gibberish and nonsensical rhymes and sophomoric sex rants. But Flea and John Frusciante, and Frusciante, when he joined the band in '88 or '89, was 19 years old. So this kid is a prodigy. They had such an incredible stoner chemistry. Both are masters of their instruments and of that sort of whatever funk, punk hybrid genre that it was an LA construct. They connected deeply with each other spiritually in their jams. And those jams became the backbone of both the pretty songs and the vicious funkers and rockers. I mean, basically, this whole album comes out of the two of them smoking weed and just coming up with those brilliant interactions between what Frusciante's doing and what Flea is doing.
Right.
So one other, I guess, kind of funny, and I'm stealing this from a friend of mine. Notice that in this year you had Under the Bridge. And then you had Nirvana's Something in the Way. There was something really sexy about being homeless on drugs and living under a bridge in 1991. There must have just been, it was like kind of maybe the cool thing to do before you sold a gazillion records and, became an icon. So,
and yeah, they really consummated their superstardom when they headlined the 1992 Lollapalooza tour, which brings us to
the first Lollapalooza tour, which was in 1991, and this is essentially the Gen X Woodstock.
Yeah.
You came up with that label, and I kind of agree with that. So Lollapalooza in 1991, this is a paradigm shifter. Arturo, did you know that Lollapalooza is a real word in the Real Dictionary?
What does it mean?
I'll tell you, and it certainly is a real word. From the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, Lollapalooza, first entry, one that is extraordinarily impressive. And the second entry is an outstanding example. The word's use dates back to the late 1800s and is meant as a slang way of expressing that something is indeed outstanding and nifty.
Why, Clinton? That is indeed a Lollapalooza.
Yes, I mean that's essentially, yeah, that's correct. And here's a very funny thing. On that same page, at least on the app version, it lists some synonyms: bee's knees, the cat's meow,
Yeah.
dilly, doozy, and Jim Dandy, with latter being my favorite. Anyway, point is, Jane's Addiction frontman probably knew what the hell he was doing when he first came up with that name and then conceived and executed Lollapalooza in 1991. The event, I think it's fair to say, became the first regular, mostly annual, big, large, loud, expansive, zeitgeist American rock and roll touring festival of the modern era. What had been a staple of the European live music scene for a long time was now on these shores, and boy, was it phenomenal. By this point in Jane's Addiction's journey as a band, we talked a little bit about this on the last episode. Relations between the band's members were at their absolute worst, to the point where, to reiterate a line I used in that episode, there wasn't a band big enough to contain both Farrell and guitarist and professional pretty man David Navarro by then. And so Lollapalooza was originally conceived as a farewell performance or sort of a going away tour by the band, and then it just sort of grew from there. Because I'm assuming that ambition and perhaps a wistfulness tied to the coming separation from such a fertile point on the alternative rock spectrum set in for Farrell. And so Lollapalooza became the outstanding example of a Jim Dandy tour, and that was born.
Yeah.
Now, some history. The original Lollapalooza tour took place, or it kicked off in that bastion of rock and roll majesty and freedom, Tempe, Arizona, on July 18th, 1991. It was a 25-date tour, and the final show took place on August 28th. So we're talking about essentially a 40-day tour. And so from there, it basically represents a transformative journey for the mainstreaming of gourmet underground rock of these times, if there ever was one. And moving forward, this was the beginning of a movement that changed tastes and style and moods, and also the visibility of liberal politics on cable TV and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, here was the inaugural Lollapalooza lineup that accompanied Jane's Addiction on the road. And this is just staggering. Here we go. Ice-T and his metal band Body Count. Violent Femmes. Living Color. Rollins Band. Nine Inch Nails. Fishbone. Susie and the Banshees. And the Butthole Surfers. So, how many iconoclasts does it take to change a light bulb? All those fucking people.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. So beyond the masterful bon voyage of Jane's Addiction, I mean, seriously, a long time ago, I listened to some of the tapes of these shows, and they're just amazing. It may not be an overstatement that Nine Inch Nails' inclusion on the bill was the endorsement of Trent Reznor that led directly to the cult of the album The Downward Spiral 3 years later. Now, this first iteration of Lollapalooza was the crucial one, brimming with mostly under-the-radar, just rising masters. It wasn't until the next year, we've referenced it a few times, in 1992, that the tour became a launching pad for a new breed of rock stars, including some of the bands we've already talked about and will talk about later in this episode. By 1996, though, the festival had really become a wet fart. And that year, it was
Metallica headlining.
Yes, it was headlined by sellout Metallica and Soundgarden, which was basically intubated and on life support at that point. Now, and then for a number of years, Lollapalooza went defunct. But of course, with branding becoming the oxygen of American business as the 21st century progresses, Lollapalooza has inevitably risen from the dead as a single annual multi-day event held at Grant Park in Chicago. It's also become a big-time moneymaker, something that probably would have repulsed the 1991 version of Farrell. Don't know about now. Hey, publishing rights and all. But back then, probably would have repulsed him. Now, according to an article published in the New York Times sometime in the last year or so, the 2019 Lollapalooza Festival grossed more than $247 million.
Wow.
Over the course of 4 days. Now, among the headliners, Ariana Grande, Childish Gambino, The Strokes, 21 Pilots, and Tame Impala. Well, at least Tame Impala is pretty good. And yeah, exactly.
Yikes.
Yes, I know. And then under these acts laid a roster of more than 100 supporting performers. I mean, basically, it was like Coachella Midwest is basically what it's become. So, hey, welcome to the death of meaning. In any case, back there in 1991, Perry Farrell and his mates created something truly special and, as I said before, paradigm shifting on a grand scale. That may never happen again, period.
Ever.
Dude, what's your take on the gestation of Lollapalooza?
I would say Glastonbury Festival has kind of the original Lollapalooza spirit is still alive, and the Leeds festivals, because they're still pretty counter. They're still pretty counterculture. Interesting. You mentioned Nine Inch Nails. In an interview, Trent Reznor years ago, many years ago, talked about how Nine Inch Nails were that tour kind of broke them a little bit with fans and got them to all go buy Pretty Hate Machine, the only thing they had out at the time. And Reznor remembers several fans throughout the tour saying, "Man, your live band fucking rocks. You guys are intense." Yeah. Then why is it that your album sounds like cheesy synth pop? So Reznor said basically he took that as a cue. Okay, I got to do something different with it. I got to make our recordings sound like our live stuff.
Yeah.
Enter the Broken EP, one of the most intense, just jarringly heavy and just rocking EPs, and my favorite EP of all time. That kind of led to the heavier guitar-driven industrial that Nine Inch Nails would do with the Broken EP especially, and of course later the Downward Spiral. Yeah, I mean, this was the Gen X Woodstock. It really was for traveling Woodstock for the Gen X crowd. It wasn't just the bands that were playing. Also, they would have tattoo parlors and tents, scattered throughout the sites. Yeah. They would have Greenpeace and I think Amnesty International.
Yep.
They would have tents scattered throughout, sending out pamphlets and paraphernalia. So it was more than just music. It was a cultural thing, really.
Yes, and that raises a point that I should make, that we can blame Perry Farrell for the terminology, the alternative nation. He came up with that, and it really didn't go away for about 4 or 5 years. But but that encompassed all of that, the liberal sort of the save the world causes, and voting rights and abortion rights and all of that, and that sort of organically optimistic and liberal universe of alternative rock. And it also, one final thought, it also amazes me that you had all of these bands, up and coming bands on that bill that not a whole lot of people had heard of. In Susie and the Banshees case, maybe they had forgotten about. And then in the midst of it, you have Ice-T.
Cop Killer!
Yeah. And so Ice-T is out there touring with all these, who the hell knew Gibby Haynes except for the hardcore Austin people at that point.
Yeah.
Pretty good discussion so far, right? Well, here we close out part 1 of this episode. Kick on over to part 2 of our deep personal revisitation of 1991, where we'll discuss a long-lost band that invented a brand new genre of rock. And then we'll talk about REM, Metallica, and Guns N' Roses. Send us a missive at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com in the meantime. Thank you.